Will you stop Terence Bud Crawford Saturday?
Put him in the dirt.
Tito always says I'm using my mouth to get my opportunities. The only person I know that made money using their mouth is his ex-wife.
Maybe you let another man smack
you want to make sure that
another man smack me, he might got to die.
You want to make sure at the end of his
Talking up trash and you might just end up getting inside your opponent's head. But if you don't, you could be headed for the embarrassment of a lifetime. Here's what happens when a trash talker gets exposed after talking crap.
I'm not going to do nothing. If you think you're tough, hey, come on. Come on.
If you make an enemy of your opponent and they leave you out cold on the canvas, you unfortunately have to deal with the embarrassment of what follows. For Gokhan Ozcan, he did everything in his power to aggravate the legend Mike Zambidis pre-fight, getting up in his face before throwing water at him. Something that nearly started a riot. Ozcan clearly didn't have the fighting chops to stand up to an opponent like this, and so, like many others we've featured in this video, he resorted to below-the-belt tactics during the bout's build-up to even the playing field. But on fight night, no amount of mental warfare was going to save Gokhan from the inevitable. Zambidis was a murderous puncher in his prime, with an undeniable finishing rate against top-level opposition. But even by his standards, he seemed to be saving something special for Ozcan. The overhand punch that took him out was as mean as they come, a nasty way to close the show. Though the pair met inside the ring for a second fight later on, Zambidis once again proved his superiority by beating Gokhan on the scorecards.
He hit that jaw all night. I didn't know his jaw was that big. You don't got a hell of a chance in the ring and out the ring. Get some fire up on the ass.
Monte Barrett doesn't seem like an idiot by any means, but his decision to antagonize his heavyweight opponent, Shane Cameron, prior to their bout, was undeniably a stupid one. It's not like Cameron was sending too many insults back in response. No, this was yet another example of a fighter relying too heavily on their words to get the job done. Barrett seemed convinced that he was aging like the finest of wines, but by the time all was said and done, his skills were made to look far inferior to his opponents. In reality, this fight wasn't competitive past the first round, and after this short feeling out process, Cameron went to work like a true fighter, with his fists rather than his words. The third round saw him drop Barrett for this first time, and it wasn't necessarily difficult for him. When the fourth came, so did the finish. An overhand that was thrown in counter to Barrett's own shot. But Cameron was quicker and landed with enough heat on it to end the fight right then and there.
Oriental title, the champion Monte Barrett. Shane Cameron in
Right? You're the Michael Jackson of boxing. You're the Michael Jackson of boxing.
See him as a simple person. He's like the original village idiot.
Tom Little is yet another name that might not ring any bells for most casual boxing fans. But when he came up against the rising Daniel Dubois, he seemed to speak with the confidence of a man who was very capable of springing an almighty upset. He took aim at Dubois' intelligence, implying that he saw Dubois as a very simple guy, without the finesse necessary to beat him. Dubois didn't seem too bothered by it, and like the rest of us, he was probably amused by this unknown fighter speaking with such confidence. Dubois' pre-fight dismissiveness of Tom Little was proven to be well placed, because when the fighting began, all that bravado Little displayed was shown to be totally empty. Dubois' power was just way too much for Little, and his body punching in particular was enough to sink Little to the canvas. Once that first knockdown came, it was only a matter of time before the finishing sequence came. This was like watching a seasoned pro taking on an amateur, and by the time Dubois' TKO came, virtually no one in the arena was surprised.
He looks as though he is poised now. He's really starting to land big shots.
Dennis Duggan was beating you. What are you talking about? He was about to get stopped.
Okay, you know what? I don't even know why I'm here.
David Benavidez is not the type of fighter you want to give added motivation to, because with a knockout ratio like his, if he smells blood, you're very likely to end up on his highlight reel. For Anthony Dirrell, who's a truly committed trash talker, he decided to try and belittle Benavidez' record, using his patented style of highly persistent trash-talking to provoke a reaction. He constantly referred to himself as a monster, and that he was about to shock the world with how easy he was about to make this look. But all this did was spur Benavidez on to an even greater performance, and when the shots started flying, his ability to put damage of Dirrell proved too much. When you factor in that Dirrell was repeatedly smiling in Benavidez's face, taunting him each time he landed, but empty taunting with nothing behind it doesn't help you win fights. When Benavidez started to pile on the pressure in the 9th, the referee deemed Dirrell unfit to continue. Yet another dominant win for Benavidez, and one more embarrassing night at the office for Dirrell.
That didn't work. Lennox, go ahead and take this right
Yeah, I mean, you know, Dirrell can't really see.
Most of his opponents get in there and they've already lost. I'm getting in there and I win it, and I'm ending it a winner.
I like that.
Azim took on Ryland Charlton in a fight between a younger rising talent, Azim, and a veteran in Charlton, who came in way too confident for his own good. He pulled every cliche in the book, calling himself the man and his opponent the boy, while telling him, "Daddy's home," and every other go-to line for a guy in his position. In his eyes, his opponent was no true fighter. He was merely an amateur who was about to realize he'd bitten off way more than he could chew. Unfortunately for him, the opposite was shown to be true, and the consequences were as violent as can be. This fight was not even close, not by any means. Azim put a beating on Charlton that added years to his gas tank, knocking him down repeatedly with all manner of huge punches, dropping him with wild swinging hooks, deft uppercuts, and eventually nearly knocking him out of the ring with an absolutely huge overhand counter shot. Charlton had been taught a lesson about humility that he won't soon forget. This was the classic case of the young killing the old, and all things considered, Charlton was foolish not to see it coming. One of the best knockouts in this video, and a truly one-sided beatdown that really left its mark.
He couldn't get his feet out quick enough, and he just left himself there and left himself exposed, and Adam just caught him with
it. Like this?
Marco Huck is not a name that most casual boxing fans will know, while Oleksandr Usyk most certainly is. These two fighters were at different points in their careers when they first met in the cruiserweight division. Usyk was on the up, while Huck, though not totally done, was certainly the fighter with more miles on the tank. Usyk was already in possession and command of the WBO title at cruiserweight when he came face-to-face with Huck, and while this was certainly a high-profile matchup for boxing hardcores, Usyk was the man who was expected to come out on top. Huck was forced to resort to other means to get into Usyk's head, relying on bringing a highly aggressive demeanor rather than his boxing skills. On fight night, it was all one-way traffic. Usyk was just better on all fronts, quicker, more accurate, and far more accurate from start to finish. He beat the brakes off Huck from the get-go, proving that Huck's defenses were absolutely no match for his offense. Usyk doesn't just throw single shots either. He punishes his opponents with huge volume. Eventually, around 10, the referee had seen enough, stepping in to save Usyk from doing some serious damage to his opponent. This is how you deal with a cocky opponent.
Continuing to unload the potency of punch that had the head swiveling of Marco Huck.
Man, I ain't scared. Ain't nobody scared of you. Trust me, bro. Trust me.
Chris Arreola did a hell of a lot of talking in the lead-up to his fight with Bermane Stiverne. And who knows why he was so confident. Stiverne had already won against him, and pretty comfortably at that. But with his promotional team firmly behind him, Arreola promised the world that the sport would be welcoming a Mexican champion to the heavyweight upper ranks.
This Mexican's gonna do it. I'ma do it. Promise that. Watch this.
And that the Haitian Stiverne would fall with little chance of the win. You gotta give Arreola some credit for his immense confidence, but as it turned out, he was about to learn a very harsh lesson. Stiverne's power, which Arreola had written off pre-fight, was actually far too much for the Mexican on fight night. Constant counter shots left Arreola with a lot to think about early on, and as the fight wore on, Stiverne's ability to find the chin got more and more consistent. Eventually, Stiverne had his opponent on skates whenever he landed big. The first knockdown that came proved beyond any doubt that Arreola's chin was not up to the task. The second, which came shortly afterwards, was enough to force the ref to stop the fight. With his dreams of bringing the title home to Mexico shattered, Arreola was forced to accept that Stiverne was simply on a different level, and no amount of trash talk was going to change that.
Had to say that he has seen enough.
Arreola coming forward. Stiverne doing a good job of...
The first and only asthmatic heavyweight champion in boxing history. Don't touch yet. Don't touch yet. Don't touch yet. Don't touch yet.
If fights were won and lost on pre-fight noise and bravado, then maybe, just maybe, Shannon Briggs would have enough in his locker to become a world champion. But the problem with his high-energy pre-fight demeanor is that his opponent, Vitali Klitschko, didn't need an ounce of that excess aggression to convince the masses that he was superior. Vitali had a quiet air of confidence to him that contrasted wildly with his opponent's far more reserved demeanor. And while Shannon roared in the Russian's face to hype himself up, Klitschko remained as calm as ever. In fact, it didn't seem like his heart rate rose, not even for a second. Briggs seemed to believe that his aggression and trash talk would give him a shot at evening the playing field in the face of his far more technically skilled opponent. On fight night, however, the hypothesis was proven wrong. Very wrong. Shannon the Cannon could never quite find his rhythm, failing to mount any meaningful offense. Klitschko, on the other hand, had very little trouble repeatedly landing on the chin of Briggs, finding home for shot after shot after shot, proving he was the far more skilled fighter. Now, we do have to give Briggs credit for the way he stuck in there and never quit on himself, but man, that's just about as much as we could say for his performance. His pre-fight energy amounted to absolutely nothing but useless noise in the end, and by the time the fight had ended, there was no doubt as to who the champ was.
Attraktiver, wieder wackelt Briggs.
Providing for your family, going out fighting,
no, it's not that.
earning a living.
Forget that.
What's
forget
fake
that.
about
Forget
that?
that.
But tell me.
Just because you beat someone when you were both young doesn't mean that you still have the tools to beat the same fighter when they reach their prime. And when Dillian Whyte came up against Anthony Joshua years after their initial collision in the amateur ranks, we got to see this rivalry have a very interesting second chapter. Whyte was pretty confident. Of that, there could be no doubt. But the way he insisted on bringing up their first fight when they were younger certainly came across as a little desperate. Joshua, by this point, had proven himself to be a far greater fighter than the youngster he once was, and during the build-up, he just kept a very cool demeanor all the way through, taking all of Whyte's comments with a very loose and disinterested attitude. Whyte was trying to sell the fight, but Joshua clearly knew that he had the mental advantage. On fight night, AJ proved that his mind was in the right place, showing up full of confidence and looking like a different level of physical specimen to Dillian Whyte. And after a grueling 7 rounds that saw Joshua bullying his rival, he turned up the heat in round 7, proving that his progression had far surpassed Whyte's, and a murderous series of punches that ended with a beautiful uppercut that sent Dillian Whyte crashing to the canvas. Joshua's redemption arc was complete, and we're sure that the early defeat had been playing on his mind ever since it originally happened.
Absolutely stunning. Well, I'd said it in the last couple of rounds.
My mouth to get my opportunities. The only person I know that made money using their mouth is his ex-wife.
Chael Sonnen might be one of the greatest trash talkers to ever grace the mic, and Tito Ortiz might be one of the worst. But that does not mean that those verbal skills are going to translate to the cage. To be fair, nobody really remembers this fight for the action on fight night. Both guys were well past their prime and not capable of producing the type of results that defined their best years. But during fight week, Sonnen turned up his trash-talking game to the max, eviscerating Tito on the mic by making some hilarious comments about his ex-wife. Tito, who is by no means a wordsmith, was walked into joke after joke, failing to mount any meaningful verbal offense of his own. But fights are not won and lost on the mic, and though Chael got a 10-8 at the presser, he was about to get beaten easily in the cage, to the point that some people were convinced that the fight was fixed. Either way, it wasn't a good look for Chael. Submission defense had always been an issue for Sonnen in the past, and after conceding an early takedown to Ortiz, Chael's defenses were sliced through like they weren't even there. And before the fight had even really started, Tito had scored the submission victory. Sure, he was made to look foolish pre-fight, but when the actual fighting began, there was only one winner, the Huntington Beach bad boy.
Early in the fight, they're dry, Tito's strong.
That's
it!
If you're gonna slap someone pre-fight, you'd better understand just how much that can anger them, possibly even spurring them on to a greater performance. For this idiot fighter, his decision to slap his adversary at the weigh-in might have been a better idea if he wasn't at such a technical disadvantage to his opponent. Sure, one of these guys looks a lot tougher than the other, but fighting isn't a contest of looks. No, this bodybuilder wannabe was not half the fighter his more physically slight opponent was. The accuracy and overall striking efficiency was all on the side of this skinnier fighter. The early exchanges showcased just how capable he was of dealing with this muscle-bound target's threat level. He pieced this dude up from the opening bell, beating him so badly that he couldn't answer the call of the bell from the stool. Total domination, and yet another important reminder not to judge a book by its cover. This roided-up beast made that mistake and ended up on his opponent's highlight reel for his troubles.
They're all gonna be surprised. I'm not gonna be surprised where I whip his ass Friday.
If you're gonna totally belittle your opponent's entire skill set and try to call him out as a joke or snake oil merchant, you'd better do better than David Rickles. Signing on the dotted line to fight Michael Venom Page is always going to be a tough task if you plan to stand and strike with him. For Rickles, he did everything in his power to try and convince himself and the media that there was very little danger coming back at him. He even mocked the idea of specific training partners being brought in, claiming he simply hired a breakdancing instructor to help him train. In the moments that preceded the bout's beginning, Rickles looked as confident as can be, totally confident in his ability to beat this hype job through his own mixed martial arts skill set. But man, if you want to avoid looking like a joke, don't quit on yourself after talking this much trash. Sure, Rickles had already been knocked down and totally dominated by MVP, and likely saved himself from a hugely damaging knockout defeat. But this guy's pride was hurt on the global stage when he decided to repeatedly signal to the referee that he was done. As bad as any performance that will feature on this list.
And that just, Rickles' face exploded much, and the referee, it's over.
Part on the belief that they're going to beat him. I don't just think or believe, I know I'm going to find a way.
When Tony Bellew met the great Oleksandr Usyk, the world knew that, at the very least, the British Bellew would certainly bring some attention to the fight, given how much star power he brings to the table. And while he was repeatedly telling the world that he meant no disrespect to Usyk, his words were largely dismissive of Usyk's abilities, and in particular, his punching power. Usyk, being the laid-back fighter he is, laughed this suggestion off, confident that his fighting would make the statement for him on fight night. When that first bell rang, though, Bellew's worst fears came to pass, when it quickly became apparent he'd severely underestimated Usyk's punching power. Tony's attempts to taunt his way through the fight didn't hide the fact that Usyk was landing, and landing often. By the time round 8 came, Usyk's shots were starting to have a considerable effect on Bellew, and eventually, Usyk laid him out with a crushing blow to finish the fight right then and there. Tony Bellew's words had come back to bite him in the most dramatic fashion imaginable.
He's really closing this gap with real, minimum effort.
It's going to probably take a few rounds, but he's a stubborn dude, but we're going to break him like a horse.
When Errol Spence Jr. and Terence Crawford threw down last year, the fans expected a rare example of a prime versus prime super fight in the boxing ring. Both men were considered to be among the greatest pound-for-pound fighters in the sport, and each had a huge reputation among the hardcore fans. Pre-fight, Spence took aim at Crawford's resume, accusing him of having the best matchmakers in the sport, and that his biggest questions had not yet been answered. Crawford, in response, waited until fight night to retaliate, but when he did, the resulting performance was one of the finest in recent boxing memory. He stepped in there for what was undoubtedly the biggest test of his entire career, and managed to pass it with flying colors, putting an increasingly more impressive showcase together round by round, until he eventually got Spence out of there in the 9th. It was a damn near perfect victory, and further proof of Crawford's standing as one of the finest pound-for-pound fighters of the modern era.
Okay, be ready. I see you Saturday. I see you Saturday.
We go to the Karate Combat Arena next for a fight between one extremely cocky fighter, a tall and rangy fighter who towered over his opponent in terms of physical size. But fights aren't won using a measuring tape, and despite his attempts to belittle and mentally dominate his adversary, the actual contest on fight night was a very different kind of story. No, this lanky athlete was about to learn a lesson about striking he won't soon forget. Every exchange seemed to get more and more in favor of the smaller fighter, and the longer it went, the more the referee started to edge closer to ending this bout. In the end, he stepped in just as it seemed like the damage was getting too great. This was a totally one-sided victory any way you look at it, and proof of just how little a height advantage can matter.
Very visibly limping.
Yep, that's it.
Yeah, he making a point to let everybody know no one in the way.
Anthony Dirrell made the same mistake the legendary Bernard Hopkins made when he told his opponent Caleb Plant that he'd never let a white boy beat him. Hopkins had said practically the same thing a few years earlier, only to lose to Joe Smith by way of violent KO. Dirrell, for whatever reason, seemed genuinely angry at Plant and had absolutely no issue telling him just how much he didn't like him on a personal level. Plant, like the rest of us, seemed a little bemused by all this extra beef, but he generally seemed to be in a pretty calm state of mind. On fight night, it showed. Dirrell was certainly not out of this fight, not by any means, but his insistence on making this personal came back to bite him badly when Plant stiffened him with a huge left hook shot in the later rounds, stunning the world with a KO of the year contender. Plant didn't waste his opportunity to rub it in either, celebrating over his unconscious opponent with a level of showmanship that Dirrell definitely hated seeing later on. But either way, this was a very one-sided personal feud, which, funnily enough, had a suitably one-sided conclusion.
Oh!